Hi, I'm Laurent. My talk today is about improving fuzzing through control compilation, and this is joint work with Akash Verma from Samsung Research America. Fuzzers that we use today are mostly coverage guided. What this means is the following. Imagine you have a fuzzer and a program on the left that the fuzzer wants to test. The fuzzer generates random input, runs it through the program, in that case, a condition which isn't satisfied. So the fuzzer just drops this input and tries to generate new input. At some point, the fuzzer generates input that satisfies the first condition and unlocks a list of instruction, which we call a basic block. This basic block is roughly a list of instruction without branches. Because this input is useful in the sense that it unlocks a new basic block, the fuzzer continues mutating this input until it finds a new input, here 13, that unlocks yet another basic block. So the takeaway here is simply that coverage is used by coverage-guided fuzzers as a feedback loop, and the unit of coverage that is used is the basic block. So now let's move on to what control compilation is. Let's continue with the example from previous slides. And as a researcher, as a practitioner, you would first compile this program, typically with optimization with a standard compiler like Clang. If you compile this program with optimization enabled, what you get is an output that looks roughly like this. So we have our two conditions, like in the original source program. But what we notice is that the compiler merges those two conditions into a single if statement. What this means is that now the compiler, the fuzzer has to guess and satisfy two conditions at once. It can no longer incrementally satisfy each condition like in the previous example. And this is obviously not ideal for a fuzzer because the probability of success is much lower. So what we see basically is that compiler optimizations in general might be harmful to fuzzing because they are intended to optimize for speed and not for fuzzing. So how do we get around this problem? Well, we could just simply disable optimization altogether. And we show in the paper that actually disabling optimization also has side effects that harm fuzzing. This is the idea where the idea of control compilation comes from. The idea is that neither disabling optimization nor enabling them is optimal, and what we really need is fine-grained control over which optimization passes are performed by the compiler. And we believe this is easier than trying to de-optimize some of the optimization that the compiler has performed. I encourage you to read the paper to have more detail about this. Now, like every research team, we wanted to evaluate control compilation. So what we did is we looked at previous papers and research, and we found that virtually all papers use one way or another a measure of coverage, which makes sense because those fuzzers are coverage guided. However, only half of those papers explain or detail what measure they use as a coverage measure. And in half of the papers that explain what measure they use, we found that there was a lot of variations. For example, some papers use basic blocks as defined at the binary level, so one that you would extract, for example, from QEMU or IDAPRO. Some other papers would use basic blocks as defined at the LLVM intermediate representation. And those two look very different in practice. We found other papers that would use AFL's unique path. So AFL is a fuzzer designed at Google, and internally it uses a coverage measure called a unique path. And we explain in the paper that this is also not appropriate for benchmarking a fuzzer. More importantly, so at that point, I guess we realized that it would be useful to try to harmonize the different measures that people use to help reproducibility and also to try to help compare papers to one another. More importantly, what we found is that most papers tend to report a single raw coverage number about coverage. For example, the total number of basic blocks visited or the total number of lines. And we found that in practice that wasn't good enough. For example, imagine we have two fuzzers, 1 and 2, that both visit the same number of lines, say 100 lines of code. It might turn out that those lines that they visit are actually very different. They might be visiting different parts of the program. And you cannot capture this with a raw number like a line coverage or a total number of basic blocks. This is where the idea of qualitative coverage came from. The idea behind qualitative coverage is that we're going to annotate each basic block or each line with a unique ID, and then we can look at which parts of the code are actually visited by a fuzzer. This turns out to be very useful if we want to understand which fuzzers complement each other and how we can compose fuzzers or techniques to try to improve coverage. So I don't have a lot of time to explain this, and this is more better explained in the paper. But I'd like to give you at least some insight about what we found. So this graph, which is pretty unusual for what you'd see in a fuzzing paper, basically shows you on the x-axis a number of fuzzers, which is not really important for this presentation. But let's zoom in on the rightmost histogram. The fuzzer that we use as a baseline here is AFL, and therefore AFL doesn't appear in this slide, in the graph. Everything that you see depicted with this green color above the 0 line is the number of lines, or the coverage, if you will, that is found by the fuzzer, but not found by AFL, the baseline fuzzer. And everything below the 0 line with the purple color shows you the number of line, or the coverage information, the coverage that is not found by the fuzzer, but is found by the AFL. So what we see here is that even though the fuzzer finds actually more coverage, more lines, it actually misses many lines that the baseline AFL finds. So if we had instead used a raw number for coverage, for benchmarking, we would have concluded that this fuzzer is slightly better than AFL, but it turns out that would be the wrong conclusion. This fuzzer actually complements AFL. And we see that this trend is actually true across many fuzzers for this target. For example, here, Laughingtail also misses as many lines as the number of new lines that it visits. Another measure that we build on top of qualitative coverage is what we call coverage consistency. Here, the idea is we'd like to understand for a particular line that a fuzzer visits, how often the fuzzer can visit it across many different runs. If we look at the left graph, here we see that this fuzzer manages to visit around 55% of its line for all the runs, which is 100%. And the one on the right side manages to visit more than 80% of the same lines across all runs, which is 100% of the time. So why is coverage consistency a useful measure to look at? Well, for example, think of a case where you would like to target one specific function. If you know that a fuzzer is very good at consistently hitting that function, then you should probably pick that fuzzer to fuzz it. Another example would be a case where you know beforehand that a fuzzer that you use is inconsistent. That informs the practitioner that it's a good idea to, for example, restart the fuzzer every now and then in order to take advantage to the best possible of the fuzzer. So basically, the takeaway message of our presentation and our paper is that control compilation does help. In general, it helps us visit more lines and find more bugs than if we didn't use it. But I think the key takeaway message is that there is no fuzzer that is the best. Most of the time, whether you look at it in terms of coverage, in terms of bugs, or in terms of consistency, fuzzers tend to complement each other. And we hope that qualitative coverage will help researchers find out which fuzzers complement each other well and how we can compose those techniques to try to improve coverage.